So for our AQA English Literature Paper 1 tragedy paper, we're looking at King Lear and the key sections in the play. And we come to Act 3, Scene 4, which is very much the heart of the play. Lear and Kent and the Fool, in the raging storm, are looking to go inside a little hovel, some kind of broken down shack or shed. And inside there already is Edgar, and he's going to emerge from the shack. So that's the action of the sequence. We're going to look at most of this scene, although it's probably only going to be about 50 or so lines usually on the actual paper, but there's a lot to consider here. So it'll be worth overlapping a bit. Locating the scene, well, it comes as the play switches between the plot and the subplot quite rapidly, because the previous scene, just a short scene in which Edmund talked to Gloucester, and Gloucester aligned himself with Lear and suggested that he'd had letters, perhaps from Cordelia, suggesting that Cordelia might return to support Lear in his hour of need. And of course, we know that Edmund is going to use that information, as he does with everything he gains, in order to advance his own position. And in the following scene from this one, in Act 3, Scene 5, we'll see Edmund go to Cornwall and treacherously inform on his father, and that immediately gains him the position of Duke of Gloucester and has Gloucester called a traitor by Cornwall. So things are moving very well for Edmund. Meanwhile, Lear is at his lowest part. He's bleakly alone, really. He's surrounded by the Fool and Kent, and Gloucester is going to come and try and help him too, but none of them really can do much to support him in this point of great sort of defeat, really, as everything's been torn away from him. He's lost and troubled and confused, but also we see a continuation of what we saw beginning in Act 3, Scene 2, that he's going to start to be a little more considerate and a little more thoughtful. So we might see that positivity emerging now towards Lear that's a little stronger than it has been up to now. Again, for the performance on stage, the storm has to still be raging. This is an immediate continuation, really, from the previous Lear scene 3-2. And what we saw was Lear just heading towards this shack, and at the beginning of this scene he goes into it, or he's about to go into it, so it's almost like there's been no gap, really, with just a very brief gap of time. So let's have a look at the scene. We start with Kent sort of ushering Lear towards this shack, enter, and again the language still conveying the sense of the storm, the tyranny and the rough, and again it's for nature to endure. So how can nature put up with this? You know, nature is bursting at the seams. Nature is working against itself. Nature is destroying itself. Lear's answer, "Let me alone," is a new kind of response, really. He hasn't shown that kind of wish to be separate from other people. He seems to want to enter a time of contemplation here amongst all this chaos of the storm. Kent remains loyal but doing what's good for him, and we see that as a reflection on what we saw in Kent in the first scene when he stood up to Lear as Lear made his big mistake. Wilt break my heart is interesting as well, isn't it? You know, you are going to break my heart by being so good for me, I think. You know, doing things to support me. You upset me. It's again a very different sort of Lear from what we've seen there, kind of emotionally aware, gentle, humble sort of Lear. And of course Kent's reply is absolutely perfect Kent. You know, it's typical Kent. "I'd rather break mine own." And he really would. He'd give everything up for Lear. What we get next is in one of the main speeches in the scene, is this fairly long, again, quite philosophical speech, and Lear seems to fumble towards philosophy in the play. He never quite says anything very tidily and neatly, but he throws lots of ideas out there, half finishes them. He was talking about what a human being needs in Act 2, and here he talks about the way in which the storm kind of distracts him from his inner torment, or perhaps the inner torment distraction from the storm. He sort of seems to muddle the two up a bit. He says there's a greater malady, so the lesser is scarce felt. So the greater pain is his internal pain, and so he doesn't feel the pain of the storm. And he gives an example: you'd run away from a bear, but if you were running towards the raging sea, then you'd turn to face the bear. So, if you wanted to escape from the storm, you might turn inward, I suppose, but his pain, inward pain, drives him to accept the storm in some way. It's not a precise metaphor already. The mind's free when the body's delicate. So that sort of reverses that and says that when I'm allowed to not worry about my body, then I can think straight, which kind of is ironic because he's trying to think straight here, but he can't, perhaps because of the storm. Then he turns it round again. The tempest in my mind does take all feeling from my other senses. So he keeps flipping backwards to where the storm distracts me from my pain, or the pain distracts me from the storm. It's a bit of both. He's not sure which, but then he fastens, unfortunately, back on his same obsession: filial ingratitude, child ingratitude. And he starts then, instead of trying to work out exactly what he means by his philosophical debate at the start of the speech, starts talking again about how his children have torn the hand that feeds, and that he'd punish and he won't weep. So these are repetitions of things he said in Act 2 and even in Act 1 to Goneril and Regan. And so this kind of obsessive returning to his own sense of injustice is something that, leaves us less sympathetic with him. And again, Shakespeare seems to be toying with our affections all the time. Again, your old kind father, whose frank heart gave all. We might say this is a rather generous self-representation, in that how kind has he been, really? And that will be something you could think about and look into. He certainly hasn't behaved kindly towards Cordelia, and barely towards Regan and Goneril, really. But that way madness lies, none of that. Well, again, the madness hovers. If we take everything away from a person, we might also take away their sense of self, that therefore their mental health will disappear and they will become incoherent, delusional, perhaps. Again, Kent, with his just gentle insistence, just go into this hovel, come on, treating him a bit like a child again, which is, again, this sort of message of the play, that the old people return to childhood almost. But this lovely bit here where he says, well, go in yourself. And again, we saw a little bit of this in Act 3, Scene 2, and now we see more of it here. Thinking of others first. You go in, and then I'll go in after you. And again, he returns to that idea that this tempest will give me a chance to think about things. Or it will prevent me, rather, from thinking about things that will hurt me. So it'll give me a chance to kind of switch off from my pain. So I'd kind of rather be out in it. But I'll go in. And then he turns to the fool, who hasn't had a line yet in the scene. In, boy, go first. And he starts to pray, as he says, or philosophize. You houseless poverty, thinking about homeless people. And then he says, no, get thee in, I'll pray, and then I'll sleep. So again, he keeps returning to helping others there, Kent, go in before me. Fool, go in before me. Thinking of them, and this is a new and more encouraging Lear. And then this important speech that follows after the fool goes in, he talks about the naked wretches, and of course we immediately think of Edgar. Two plots being drawn together here through this imagery, and he thinks about their houseless heads and unfed sides, looped and windowed raggedness. So just these beggars with no good clothes to wear. How can they defend themselves against this weather? I've taken too little care of this. Take physic pomp, so take medicine, ritual pomp, luxury. So in other words, I've got to learn what it's like to be poor. And this is the medicine that I had to take, really, to learn that being poor, is a terrible, terrible thing. And of course, But actually Lear is just the same as these poor people. He's not really superior to them except in the luxuries that he's accrued. So he says, as a kind of imperative, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, and then you'll shake the superflux to them. You'll give charity, basically, because you've felt what it's like to be poor. You'll be more generous to the poor. There's some definite hope in that, isn't there? That he is thinking about others, but you might also say that he's still not quite capable of really feeling for anybody without experiencing it himself. He can only really feel sorry for somebody because he's living through it himself, which is not quite a mature attitude yet, but at least it's a long way from the sort of total self-importance that is shown elsewhere. However, in this moment, of course, the storm is still raging, and just as if to remind us, Edgar emerges and adds to the chaos of the scene and takes away any moment of stillness and reflection there that might have begun to take place. We might sort of think, oh, Lear might have a real moment, a real epiphany, a real enlightenment, but we hear this voice from within shouting nonsense, full fathom and a half, poor Tom. The fool runs out. Oh, there's a spirit, he says. Kent tries to work it out, and the fool keeps saying, no, it's a spirit, some kind of ghost or monster or something. And then in comes Edgar disguised as a madman, and he talks about the foul fiend follows me, sharp hawthorn blows, cold wind, cold bed. So his language is full of a kind of mad raving, but it creates again a chaotic, stormy sense of the world as a place of violent horror, really. And it brings out the worst in Lear, who says, well, has his daughters done this to him, basically? Because he can't really see, and it emphasises what the last speech suggested, that although he is improving his sense of others, he can't really see anything except through his own perspective, and everything has to be like to do with daughters. And then we get a long raving speech, which basically is just, again, a lot of chaotic, violent language of what Edgar imagines a lunatic, a madman would say, and talks about him being dragged through and poisoned, and then just sort of nonsense words, lots of whirlwinds and blastings, and quite harsh sounding words, all creating a sense of a raving lunatic, a stormy, chaotic scene. And as if we've forgotten, the note tells us storm still. And again, and Lear's only response is, has his daughters taken everything from him? Is this what happens when your daughters take everything? The fool still manages to chip in a little joke, says, at least he's got a blanket, otherwise we'd all be in shame, so presumably the actor has to wear something to cover his nakedness. Kent, kind of a bit frustrated by Lear's insane obsession, says he doesn't have any daughters, what are you talking about? And Lear now gets angry with him, so there's a real sort of veering away, the way that language and the discourse shifts from something quite reflective and peaceful to just mad raving from, first of all, Edgar, and then Lear seems to echo that with his own mad ravings. Nothing could have done this to him except daughters, he says. And he talks about the pelican daughters, which is famously the babies were supposed to sort of nip blood off their parents and eat off their parents. Edgar throws in a bit of nonsense words, again, just to keep up the act. And of course, we've got this sense of what is going on for Edgar here. This is very unlike the Edgar we saw early on in the play. And it is this cathartic outspilling of nonsense language, like a kind of turbulent fugue state of just unable to stop raving, which is an act, of course. He's putting it on, but almost at times we begin to wonder how much he is putting it on, how much he's just kind of raging. There was something years ago in the sort of hippie days of the 1960s that used to get people to do primal scream therapy, which was that you go out into a wood somewhere and you shout and scream at the top of your voice because it'll release all your pent-up frustrations. It seems in some ways that's what Edgar does. Lear talks to him as if he's some kind of wise person. He says, "Oh, tell me about yourself." And so Edgar makes up a lot of raving nonsense again about I was a serving man, um, and tells a little story. He mentions lust again. This seems to crop up all the time. That sort of sexuality is seen as a dark force within the play, something dangerous. Um, and then he goes into a load of sort of animal imagery, hogs and foxes and wolves and dogs and lions. So, the bestial sort of imagery that makes Edgar into some sort of beast. None of it really makes any sense. He mentions brothels again, this sort of, everybody seems to resort to sexualized language in their sort of disturbed state. We'll see Lear do that as well in Act 4. And then just sheer nonsense, Dolphin, my boy. And then you get that really key speech from Lear. And this is why I've dragged it on a little bit longer than I've seen would normally be on the paper, because we want to read. He says, "You'd be better in the grave than to look like this." And then he asks, "Is man no more than this? Consider him well, thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Here's three of us, as sophisticated. Thou, at the thing itself, unaccommodated man, is no more than such a bare, forked animal." So, it's that idea that here is Edgar. He's essential humanity for you. What happens when you take everything away from a person? There he is, this bare animal, hopeless really, defenseless against the weather. Not going to survive very long really in that state. And then he, in his madness, and you see he's sort of losing control of his senses really, and being delusional. I better take my clothes off and sort of reduce myself to his state. Because perhaps Edgar sees a physical representation of his sense of his own reduction. And the fool tries his best to kind of joke him out of that and says, "It's a naughty night to swim in. Come on, it's too cold to be getting your clothes off and going swimming." And then he sees Gloucester arrive. And we'll pause it there really, because there's not much more in this scene, except there's a little bit of that strange sense of Edgar noticing that Gloucester's come and sort of hovering in the background and pretending, as Gloucester arrives, he goes into a long, raving, mad speech to try and just reassure anybody, particularly Gloucester, that this couldn't possibly be Edgar, that it has to be just some lunatic. But also, the pain and suffering seems to come out of him there as he sees his own father, who has abandoned him and called him traitor. So there's this weird thing in which Edgar and Gloucester are very close together physically in the play, but Gloucester never notices it until really very late in the play, and then off stage when Edgar has to tell him who he is. So Gloucester's blindness, I suppose, continues throughout the play. He never really sees his own son, never saw him before really. So we've got this moment then in the play, which is the essence of the play, I think. Unaccommodated man. It's that phrase that the play's been heading towards. It's been trying to say, what happens when you strip everything away from us? You rob us of all our property, all our luxuries, all our clothing, all our family, all the people who love us. What's left? Is there anything left? And at this point in the play, it seems like no, you're left in this state of complete vulnerability, madness, discomfort, horror, the victim of the natural world. There's nothing really here to say that there's any hope for us if we take away the covering of our rather luxurious lives. It's all a bit hopeless and bleak. There's nothing underneath the surface of that. That's all really covering up the fact that we are this bare-forked animal. We're just trying to avoid the fact that we're useless and hopeless, and we live in a meaningless and bleak and violent world in which we are at the mercy of forces beyond our control. So this is why this play is of towering significance, because it expresses this very bleak but very pertinent view of human existence, in particular if you take away any sense of any religious belief. This is reality. It's the feeling we get when we doom scroll through the news and think, this is it, is it? This is what the world's like: wars, and violence, and horrific riots, and nastiness, and cruelty, and the terrible people getting away with doing terrible things. It makes us think that the universe is a bleak and miserable place. And at this point in the play, at least, it's hard to say that Shakespeare isn't telling us exactly that.